The Germanic languages, or Teutonic as they are often called in older literature, are a family of related languages primarily found in Central and Northern Europe. The family includes a range of languages such as German, Icelandic, English, and even Afrikaans, spoken in Southern Africa. Fun fact, Afrikaans is the only Germanic language to have been written in the Arabic script, or at least till my adaptation for New England English catches hold. We classify these languages as a single family, as they all share similar features phonologically, morphologically, and syntactically. These linguistic features were in turn inherited from a single common ancestor. However, this ancestor was never written down. Because of this, we do not have any records or direct evidence that it existed, like we do for Latin, Greek, or even Old Church Slavonic. So instead, linguists have reconstructed how we believe it would have looked based on evidence from all the known Germanic languages, living and dead, and have dubbed this theoretical language Proto-Germanic. However, Proto-Germanic isn't the earliest ancestor of the Germanic languages. In fact, we can actually go one level higher on the family tree to Proto-Indo-European. This is the reconstructed ancestor of many of today's languages, including most of Europe, a chunk of the Middle East, and northwestern India. Now there are many things that we could explore in relation to Proto-Germanic and its daughter languages. We could talk about Grimm's and Werner's laws, which led to p, t, and k in PIE becoming f, th, and ch in the Germanic languages, leading to cognates like fish and Pisces, thin and tenuous, as well as horse and curus between English and Latin. Or we could talk about the double declension system of adjectives, where adjectives would change form based on whether the noun it's modifying is definite or not, a common feature in most Germanic languages today, save English. But today, we're not going to talk about those. Instead, we're going to focus on what is, in my opinion, the most defining feature of the Germanic languages, its verbal inflections, and how they developed into the English verbs we use today. Now, narrowing the scope real quick to something familiar, let's talk about modern English verbs. English is usually said to have 2 to 4 types of verbs, the regular verbs and the irregular verbs. Oftentimes you'll see the modal verbs as well as the copular verb to be being classified as their own category of verb. Now, in order to tell what type of verb a verb is, you need to look at 3 of its forms: the infinitive, which is uninflected in English and often seen with the word to, the past tense form, which shows that an action happens in the past, as well as the past participle, which functions like an adjective, is used to form the perfect tense, as well as the passive tense. The regular verbs in English form both their past tense and past participle by suffixing an ed to the infinitive form of the verb, so you get to work, worked, have worked. The irregular verbs are any verb that doesn't follow that regular pattern I just mentioned. Sometimes the past and past participle will have the same form, like to keep, kept, have kept. Other times, the past and past participle will also have the same form as the infinitive, to cut, cut, have cut. A few verbs even devoice the final d to t in both forms, like in send, sent, have sent. The majority of the time, however, the past tense of the irregular verb will have a change in the vowel of the stem, with the past participle also taking a similar change, as well as an additional en suffix every now and then, thus giving us verbal paradigms like to sing, sang, have sung, as well as to break, broke, have broken. There are other types of irregular verbs as well that just go on and do their own thing, like go, went, have gone, and stand, stood, have stood. Modal verbs are weird in that they don't have past participles, and that their past tenses often act as their own separate verb. They also do not take an s suffix in the third person singular, so instead of the normal I run, you run, he runs, modal verbs instead go I can, you can, he can. Finally, there is the king of irregular verbs in English, to be. This verb can either be classified as an irregular verb or a verb in its own class, as unlike the irregular verbs in other irregular verbs, You can't guess the conjugations of the verb by looking at its infinitive, past, or past participle. Now, if you've ever taken an English class, you've probably learned about the various types of verbs and probably complained about why there are so many irregulars in English. But English isn't alone in this situation, because if you look at other Germanic languages, you can see that they have very similar systems in place. They have regular verbs that form their past and past participle using an alveolar or dental suffix, and they also have irregular verbs that also mark their past tense with a change in the stem vowel, and a vowel change in the past participle with an N suffix. Just like English, all these Germanic languages inherited these verbal inflections from their common ancestor language, Proto-Germanic. But why do the Germanic verbs have such distinct styles of marking the past and past participle? And how did it lead to modern English's verbal system? In order to answer that, we're going to have to reorganize our verbs based on how their forms evolved from Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic, and then how those same verbs ended up in English. The first group we're going to explore are the Germanic strong verbs, the verbs which will eventually make up the majority of English's irregulars. The first thing to know about Germanic strong verbs are that they came into Proto-Germanic and eventually English directly from PIE itself. See, in PIE there's a system of vowel alternation known as Ablaut. This Ablaut would change the root vowel E into an O, a long E, long O, or even make the vowel disappear entirely, depending on the derivation and inflection morphology around the root. You can see this Ablaut in effect with the PIE word for father and its ancient Greek reflex. Reflex here meaning the descendant of an element-like word or morpheme from an earlier form of language. Dictionaries, so useful. However, not all words were affected by Ablaut. Ablaut in PIE could be blocked on the main root by an intervening vowel, like the PIE word for bear, which would go on to become Greek arctos. This might not be the best example, as the root vowel here is in the 0 grade, but notice the extra vowel between the root and the inflectional endings. In the transition from PIE to Proto-Germanic and beyond, this thematic vowel spread to most verbs, leaving the majority of verbs with an E in their stem and a thematic vowel afterwards. Let's take the Proto-Germanic word for to freeze, freusano, as an example. The I there is due to the fronting of E caused by the I in the suffix. This thematic vowel, however, only spread to one class of verbs known as imperfectives, which would go on to become the present tense of Germanic strong verbs today. Another class, known as statives, which took a different set of endings from the imperfectives, never acquired this thematic vowel. Because the statives didn't take the thematic vowel, the root vowel E turned into an O in the singular and would be dropped in the plural. In Proto-Germanic, short O and A would merge into A in the singular, and U rose from a semivowel into a full nucleic vowel replacing the missing E. These statives were then recategorized from their own separate group of verbs into the past tense of their thematic equivalents. Finally, the root vowel of the verb plus the adjectival marker nos, which deleted the root vowel, was reanalyzed as the past participle of the verb. From these changes, plus the sound that followed the root vowel, Proto-Germanic acquired 7 classes of strong verbs. The outlier here being class 7, which retained the reduplicated root from PIE stative verbs. But all descendants, aside from Gothic, would later collapse this reduplication into a new Ablaut class. The words from top to bottom in modern English are to ride, to freeze, to bind, to bear, to give, to bake, and to grow. If you've ever studied German or Icelandic or any other Germanic language, you've probably seen these classes. And they stayed fairly structured in those languages as well as Old English. But from Old English to Modern English, these classes would slowly fall apart. Aside from classes 1, 3, and 4, all other classes have lost their cohesion to sound changes and regularization of the verbs to the weaker classes, which we'll go into next. Because of this, the once regular strong verbs are now largely irregular. With the strong verbs out of the way, let us now move on to the weak verbs, which would form the basis of the regular verbs and some irregular verbs in English. Weak verbs arose from the PIE-derived verbs. Unlike the verbs that became the strong verbs, which were formed from a root, a possible suffix, or a thematic vowel, derived verbs were formed through affixation of another word. Take the PIE word for to sit. This strong verb is formed by a root, the suffix ye, and the inflectional affix t. To get the causative verb to set, as in to set something down, you add the causative suffix after the root, which takes the o grade, and before the ye, forming sodayetti. Another example would be deriving a verb, like to name, from a noun, name. To derive the verb, you just slap on yeti, as you can see on screen now. However, because these verbs are not constructed from roots, but from other words themselves, they did not possess possible stative verb equivalents, like the root verbs did. So when the root, aka strong verbs, took the stative verbs as their past tense in Proto-Germanic, the derived verbs had no past tense, only possessing the present tense and the past participle, formed by adding tos to the verb instead of nos. This meant they had to innovate their own past tense. They did this by taking the past participle of the derived verb and adding the stative form of the old Germanic word for to do afterwards, making a new paraphrastic phrase to mark the past tense with. This phrase was then rechunked and reanalyzed into a singular inflectional suffix before being reduced in form. However, just like the strong verbs before them, there are different types of weak verbs. Since we're focusing on English verbs, we only need to go over 3 out of the 7 groups. The first group are the class 2 weak verbs, which in Old English took an O between the stem of the verb and the past inflectional suffix. This class would eventually become the basis of all regular verbs in modern English, with the O wearing into a schwa in Middle English and eventually disappearing in modern English, but still being retained as an E in writing. The second group of verbs are the class 1 weak verbs. In Proto-Germanic, these verbs took an intervening E or Y sound between the stem and the inflectional suffix, in both the past and present tense. By Old English, this E had been dropped after fronting the preceding vowel, bringing the stem and the inflectional suffix into contact. If the verb stem ended in a D or a T, then the past suffix merged into one with the stem, leading to the modern English verbs, where the present, past, and past participle of a verb all have the same form, like the example on screen of set, as well as cut, cast, cost, shed, etc. If the verb stem had a long vowel in the final syllable, the vowel would shorten, leading to forms like keep versus kept, bread versus bread, and read versus read. If the verb stem ended in a liquid nasal plus D, this D would devoice in the past tense in Middle and Modern English, due to a reanalysis of the underlying form of the past suffix from a D to a T due to words like keep, kept. Finally are the irregulars of class 1 weak verbs. In Proto-Germanic, there are 7 verbs within this category, but only 4 of them have survived to modern English. 3 of the verbs had an intervening E in the present but no vowel in the past. This caused fronting or umlaut in the present tense, but not in the past tense. There was also a sound change that fricatized velars before T or D. These sound changes led to seek, sought, buy, bought, and think, thought. Now usually these patterns would have been regularized. However, in Proto-Germanic, this pattern actually spread to other verbs that ended in K and L, leading to words like teach, taught, and sell, sold. The last of the 4 verbs, bring, followed a similar pattern, just without the umlaut in the present. The third group of verbs we're going to look at are the preterite present verbs. These are verbs that in the transition from PIE to Proto-Germanic never lost their stative conjugations in the present tense, meaning that these verbs conjugate in the present tense like the past tense of strong verbs. This can be seen in English by the lack of an S for the third person singular, though I think it's a bit more noticeable in German and Icelandic. Because of this, preterite present verbs, much like weak verbs, had to develop their own past tense, which they did by copying the weak verbs, Later in English specifically, the non-modal preterite-present verbs all fell out of use, or were regularized, meaning the only verbs left in English that were preterite-present were the auxiliary modal verbs. This is why the modal verbs in English don't take an S in the third person singular. Later as well, the past tense of the modal verbs in English developed somewhat separate meanings from those of the present, due to the merging of the Old English subjunctive and past conjugations, effectively making them separate words entirely. Finally is the verb to be, the most irregular of irregular verbs in English. Unsurprisingly, the verb or verbs meaning to be have always been a bit irregular throughout the history of English, as well as basically every other language in existence. However, in English at least, I think it is the easiest one of these verbs to explain. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how the strong verbs received their past tenses from the old PIE stative verb, a completely different set of verbs that made up their own independent class. Well, that process of one word losing its independence and becoming part of the conjugation paradigm of another word is called suppletion. Usually suppletion works on a much smaller scale than the shift from PIE verbs to Proto-Germanic verbs, like how went, originally the past tense of wend, meaning to turn, through suppletion replaced the original past tense of go, yod. So everything irregular with to be is almost entirely because of suppletion. The forms of the verb that start with be come from the Old English verb beon, which in turn came from Proto-Germanic beuna, and ultimately from the PIE word meaning to grow or appear. Originally, the forms of beuna covered the present indicative as well, which can still be seen in the singular first and second present indicative in German. However, both the present and past indicative forms were suppleted by the verb wezana, whose present indicative is also suppleted from yet another verb in Proto-Germanic. The past tense forms, the ones with w at the beginning, all come from the thematic PIE verb weseti. Meanwhile, the present tense singular forms come from the athematic PIE verb heseti, making to be in English a bit of a Frankenstein's monster. So there you go, the history of English verbs and the origin of many of English's irregular verbs. Now of course I didn't cover every irregular verb out there. The video is long enough as it is. However, if there is a specific irregular verb you are curious about in English, leave a comment below. I'll probably leave you a reply. Anyway, see you next time. Hey you! Check out my Patreon. It helps support the channel.